On an overcast morning in the quaint town of Mapleford, Everett Langston found himself at the center of an unexpected dispute. A soft drizzle pattered on the windowpanes of his modest home as he prepared for another day of quiet routine. At the heart of his solace was his prized possession, a lovingly restored vintage bicycle he had come to call Sunbeam. Found at a local flea market and painstakingly revived with his own hands, Sunbeam was not merely a mode of transport, it was a cherished escape from the drudgery of daily work. That very morning, as Everett was sipping his steaming mug of coffee, a knock echoed at his door. His neighbor, Beatrice Bloom, a lady known for her high-handed manner and an unwavering belief in her own superiority, stood on the threshold. With a haughty tilt of her head, she demanded that Everett lend Sunbeam to her son, Roderick. According to Beatrice, Roderick, who she claimed was a remarkably well-behaved child, was in desperate need of the bicycle for his daily adventures. Her tone brooked no dissent, she insisted that the bike, a vehicle of freedom and joy, should rightfully belong to her family. Everett's heart sank at her request. Sunbeam was not only his prized possession but also a symbol of his personal triumph, a relic that he had restored against the odds and that now offered him solace from a taxing work life. He had grown accustomed to the gentle hum of its gears and the liberating rush it provided on quiet country roads. With measured calm, he explained to Beatrice that Sunbeam was far too temperamental for a youngster's reckless handling. He recounted its quirks, its delicate balance, and its need for careful treatment, qualities that made it unsuitable for someone unversed in its care. Beatrice, however, dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Roderick is far more advanced than you think," she insisted imperiously. Her eyes flashed with a stubborn determination that left little room for negotiation. Everett, though troubled by her dismissive attitude, knew that his bond with Sunbeam was sacred. He had invested not only money but also heart and soul into restoring it. To relinquish the bicycle, even temporarily, would feel like sacrificing a piece of his very identity. As the conversation unfolded, the tension between practicality and entitlement became palpable. Beatrice's request, wrapped in condescension and self-importance, clashed with Everett's deep-seated need to protect something he held dear. The drumming rain outside served as a quiet counterpoint to the escalating conflict inside his living room. For Everett, this was not merely a disagreement about a bicycle, it was a battle for autonomy and respect, principles he cherished above all. In that charged moment, Everett's refusal was resolute. He informed Beatrice, with gentle firmness, that Sunbeam would remain with him. Despite her protests, he stood his ground, determined that his treasured bicycle would not be commandeered by entitlement. And so, with the rain continuing its steady cadence outside, a quiet but profound declaration was made: some treasures, earned through sweat and heart, were never up for negotiation. After the tense exchange that morning, Everett Langston's day took on an unforeseen heaviness. The gentle rhythm of Mapleford, usually a source of comfort, now seemed punctuated by the echoes of Beatrice Bloom's demands. As Everett tended to his daily routine, riding Sunbeam along familiar country lanes and losing himself in the simple pleasure of wind and freedom, the specter of that confrontation loomed large in his mind. Beatrice had returned later that day, her presence as imposing as ever. In the soft afternoon light filtering through his study window, she reiterated her request. With a mixture of entitlement and self-assurance, Beatrice argued that Roderick, her precocious son, deserved Sunbeam. She contended that the bicycle, a paragon of mobility and delight, would greatly benefit his young life. To her, it was not merely an object, it was a gift that she believed should be shared with her family for his future success. Everett listened intently, his calm exterior belying the inner conflict raging within him. He had long since formed a deep bond with Sunbeam, a connection that went far beyond mechanical parts and nostalgic memories. It was his labor of love, a project that had rejuvenated his spirit during trying times. With each word Beatrice spoke, his resolve to protect his cherished bicycle grew stronger. In a measured tone, he reiterated that Sunbeam was not a toy to be freely loaned. "This bicycle is temperamental," he explained, describing in detail the delicate craftsmanship and careful restoration it required. It demands a certain respect and expertise that not everyone possesses. He painted a picture of the long hours spent meticulously repairing each component and the countless weekends dedicated to ensuring its smooth operation. To him, Sunbeam was the embodiment of personal triumph, a tangible reminder of his ability to breathe new life into forgotten relics. Beatrice, however, brushed aside his concerns with haughty assurance. "Roderick is more than capable," she insisted, her tone laced with condescension. She portrayed her son as a prodigy, a child of extraordinary skill who could handle even the most finicky of machines. Her words, however, struck Everett as little more than empty boasts. He recalled instances when her family's attitude had bordered on arrogance, and he wondered if her true intent was less about Roderick's welfare and more about asserting her dominance in the neighborhood. As the afternoon wore on, the conversation deepened into a subtle yet bitter contest of wills. Neighbors who passed by Everett's window caught snippets of the heated dialogue, their hushed whispers carrying the tale of the disagreement. The incident, though seemingly trivial on the surface, had begun to erode the gentle harmony of Mapleford. Everett felt the weight of responsibility, not only to protect his treasured bicycle but also to stand up against a mindset that sought to impose unwarranted demands on personal property. In that quiet, sunlit room, amidst the ticking of a grandfather clock and the rustle of pages in an old book, Everett made his decision. With calm determination, he resolved that Sunbeam would not be lent out to anyone, not even to those whose requests were wrapped in notions of entitlement. The bond between him and his restored bicycle was sacred, a private treasure earned through years of hard work. And so, despite Beatrice's fervent appeals, he maintained that Sunbeam would remain his, a steadfast symbol of his independence and a beacon of his personal triumph. The debate over Sunbeam was more than a simple matter of borrowing a bicycle, it had become a clash of temperaments and ideologies between two neighbors. Everett Langston, with his quiet pride and meticulous care for his restored bicycle, found himself pitted against Beatrice Bloom, whose assertive demands reflected a belief in entitlement and superiority. The tension that simmered between them was emblematic of deeper, unspoken conflicts that ran through the fabric of Mapleford's community. For Everett, Sunbeam was a labor of love. Each scuff, each lovingly polished gear, told the story of long days spent at the flea market and even longer hours in his workshop. It was not merely an object of transportation, it was his companion, a cherished token of his ability to reclaim beauty from neglect. He understood that to lend Sunbeam was to risk the loss of its essence, its character, its soul. He had restored it not just to functionality, but to a state of personal perfection that resonated with his very identity. Beatrice, on the other hand, saw Sunbeam through a lens of opportunity and entitlement. In her eyes, the bicycle was a tool for shaping a bright future for her son, Roderick, a means by which he could learn discipline and responsibility. Her insistence that Roderick deserved the bicycle was less about its technical merits and more about an assertion of her vision for what was rightfully hers. In her view, every well-behaved child should be granted the benefits of such prized possessions, regardless of the personal history behind them. The conversation grew heated as both parties laid out their arguments. Everett detailed the quirks and idiosyncrasies of Sunbeam, emphasizing that its temperamental nature required constant care and a deep understanding of its mechanisms. He spoke with passion about the restoration process, about the delicate balance of vintage engineering that made Sunbeam unique. His words were measured and filled with a quiet dignity, a stark contrast to Beatrice's impatient declarations. Beatrice dismissed his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Roderick is advanced beyond your imagining," she declared, her tone imbued with a sense of certainty that brooked no discussion. To her, the technical details were irrelevant compared to the promise of a brighter future for her son. Yet Everett saw through the veneer of her argument. He recognized that her demand was less about Roderick's capability and more about enforcing a kind of social order that placed personal property on a pedestal, to be shared or sacrificed at the behest of those with enough nerve to demand it. As the exchange continued, onlookers in the neighborhood began to take note. Passers-by and casual acquaintances whispered about the conflict, each adding their own interpretation to the unfolding drama. Everett's steadfast refusal, underlined by his deep attachment to Sunbeam, resonated with many who understood the value of personal labor and dedication. Meanwhile, Beatrice's tone of entitlement stirred controversy among those who saw her demands as overreaching. By the time the conversation drew to a close, it was clear that no compromise would be reached. Everett's resolve to keep Sunbeam under his care was unshakable, while Beatrice's insistence on bestowing it upon Roderick only deepened the divide between them. In that moment, their clash became a microcosm of larger societal tensions, between preservation and progress, between personal sacrifice and entitlement. And so, with no further words exchanged, both parties retreated, leaving behind an atmosphere heavy with unresolved conflict and unspoken challenges that would continue to echo through Mapleford. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the initial conflict over Sunbeam escalated into an all-out neighborhood feud that no one could have anticipated. What started as a single, resolute refusal by Everett Langston to lend his beloved bicycle now morphed into a dramatic confrontation that threatened to upend the quiet equilibrium of Mapleford. That evening, Beatrice Bloom returned to Everett's door, her eyes ablaze with determination and indignation. With a voice raised in righteous fury, she insisted once again that her son, Roderick, was the rightful beneficiary of Sunbeam. "Your precious bike belongs to the community, and especially to a promising child like Roderick," she declared, her tone dripping with condescension. For Beatrice, every word was a battle cry. A declaration that personal possessions were secondary to the collective good as she saw it. Everett, however, remained unyielding. He reiterated that Sunbeam was not simply a piece of metal and rubber but a finely tuned instrument of personal expression and hard work. "This bicycle," he stated firmly, "has been restored with care and love. It is not a toy to be passed around on a whim." His voice, calm and steady despite the rising tension, resonated with those who had long admired his dedication to craftsmanship. The conversation quickly drew the attention of passers-by and neighbors who were heading home after a long day's work. Rumors of the confrontation spread rapidly through Mapleford. Some neighbors, sympathetic to Everett's painstaking efforts to preserve a cherished relic, began to murmur their support. Others, however, were swayed by Beatrice's impassioned arguments, convinced that Roderick deserved every opportunity to thrive, no matter the cost to someone else's pride. Tempers flared when Beatrice's frustration reached its peak. In a moment of exasperation, she threatened to escalate the matter further. "If you won't give Sunbeam to my son, I will not hesitate to take this to the authorities," she proclaimed, her voice echoing down the quiet street. The threat was not empty. Beatrice had a reputation for sparking controversies that sometimes drew the intervention of local officials. Her words sent ripples through the gathered crowd, and soon the air was thick with anticipation of what might come next. Everett's response was measured and resolute. He explained that his decision was based on the unique nature of Sunbeam, a bicycle that required more than just casual care. It needed someone who understood its history, its temperamental quirks, and the personal sacrifices it represented. "I built this bike with my own hands," he said, his eyes reflecting a quiet determination, "and I will not see it mishandled by those who cannot appreciate its worth." As the exchange escalated, neighbors began to take sides. Some rallied around Everett, praising his commitment to preserving something that was clearly more than a mere object. It was a symbol of perseverance and personal achievement. Others, however, felt that Beatrice's call for community support was justified, arguing that if one child could benefit from such a prized possession, then it should be shared for the greater good. In the midst of this rising chaos, a few onlookers tried to mediate, urging both parties to seek a compromise. Yet, the deep-seated convictions on both sides left little room for negotiation. Beatrice's insistence on what she considered to be a moral imperative clashed head-on with Everett's steadfast determination to protect his labor of love. As night fell over Mapleford, the confrontation reached a crescendo. Words were exchanged, tempers flared, and what had begun as a simple dispute over a bicycle became a battleground for broader values. Of individual achievement versus communal entitlement, of personal responsibility versus imposed obligation. The entire neighborhood buzzed with the drama, and even those who had remained neutral found themselves forced to take a stand. By the time the confrontation subsided, it was clear that both Everett and Beatrice had dug in their heels. Their once cordial neighborhood relationship had fractured under the weight of uncompromising pride and bitter resentment. Everett returned to his home with Sunbeam safely by his side, while Beatrice stormed off, vowing that this was not the end. The seeds of discord had been sown deeply that night, and the quiet streets of Mapleford would never be the same. The feud between Everett Langston and Beatrice Bloom took an even darker turn in the days following their heated confrontation. As word of their dispute spread throughout Mapleford, the tension escalated from mere verbal skirmishes to the threat of involving external authorities. Beatrice, unwilling to accept Everett's firm stance, resorted to drastic measures, threatening to call the police and frame his refusal as an act of bicycle hoarding. In the early hours of one chilly morning, Beatrice's anger boiled over. Determined to force Everett's hand, she dialed 911, reporting that Everett was illegally withholding Sunbeam from the community. The call was filled with accusations of selfishness and neglect, painting a picture of a man who was, in her view, denying a deserving child his rightful share of happiness. The authorities, though initially skeptical, dispatched a small contingent of local officers to investigate the claim. The arrival of the police created a scene that was both surreal and disheartening. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, their faces a mix of confusion and curiosity, as officers began to question Everett about his possession of Sunbeam. Everett, ever the epitome of calm, explained his position with clarity. He produced documentation of his purchase and restoration of the bicycle, a collection of receipts, photographs, and personal notes that attested to the countless hours he had invested in reviving the vintage relic. His testimony was a stark contrast to Beatrice's impassioned but unsubstantiated claims. Despite the compelling evidence in Everett's favor, Beatrice's campaign of intimidation did not cease. In the midst of the police inquiry, she continued to vociferously insist that her son, Roderick, was being unjustly denied a chance at joy. Her neighbors, previously divided in their loyalties, began to murmur among themselves about the nature of fairness and community responsibility. The unfolding drama was quickly becoming a local spectacle, one that was reported on by nearby news outlets and discussed fervently in town meetings. The police, after a brief investigation, concluded that there was no criminal wrongdoing on Everett's part. They determined that the matter was strictly civil and that no law had been broken. This decision, however, only fueled Beatrice's determination. Convinced that justice had been denied, she threatened to escalate the situation further by seeking legal recourse in civil court. For Everett, the intervention of the authorities was a bitter irony. His cherished Sunbeam, a symbol of personal triumph and artistic restoration, had become the center of a public relations battle. He felt that the intrusion of the police into what should have been a private matter not only tarnished his reputation but also undermined the spirit of individuality and respect that he had fought so hard to embody. The community's reaction was mixed. Some residents rallied behind Everett, applauding his calm dignity in the face of unfounded allegations. They saw his refusal as a stand for personal rights, a defense of the fruits of one's labor against the encroachments of entitlement. Others, swayed by Beatrice's impassioned rhetoric, began to question whether Everett's attachment to Sunbeam was masking a deeper, unyielding selfishness. Amid this growing controversy, local authorities made a public announcement urging residents to resolve their disputes through dialogue rather than legal intimidation. The mayor even called for a community forum to discuss issues of fairness and property rights in Mapleford. This forum, scheduled for the following week, promised to be a turning point, a chance for the entire neighborhood to address not only the incident with Sunbeam but also the broader cultural divide that it represented. As the days wore on, Everett prepared meticulously for the forum. He gathered all his evidence and rehearsed his testimony, determined that his side of the story would be heard clearly and respectfully. For him, this was not just about a bicycle. It was about reclaiming dignity in a community increasingly marred by baseless power plays and the misuse of authority. Beatrice, on the other hand, continued her campaign with fiery determination, vowing that no matter the outcome of the forum, she would not rest until Roderick had what she believed was rightfully his. The stage was now set for a dramatic showdown, a public intervention that would force Mapleford to confront its values and, perhaps, pave the way for healing old wounds. In the wake of the authorities' dismissal of Beatrice Bloom's claims, the simmering feud between her and Everett Langston took a sharp turn toward personal retribution. The community, already rattled by the police's involvement in what had once been a private dispute, now witnessed an escalation that bordered on outright harassment. Beatrice, refusing to accept the verdict of no criminal wrongdoing, devised a new plan to unsettle Everett and exact her form of retribution. Determined to tarnish the sanctity of his prized possession, she began orchestrating a series of calculated disturbances aimed directly at his property. The first act of retaliation was subtle yet insidious. She began luring flocks of pigeons into Everett's meticulously maintained yard, hoping that the persistent cooing and mess would disrupt his peace and, worse, damage the pristine condition of his garden. Everett, known throughout Mapleford not only for his restoration work but also for his love of order and nature, was deeply disturbed by this act. His yard was a testament to years of careful planning, a place where each flower and shrub was arranged with artistic precision. The sudden influx of pigeons, with their droppings and incessant clamor, was an affront to everything he held dear. He knew that Beatrice's actions were not spontaneous but a deliberate attempt to unsettle him. In response, Everett resolved to fight back, but not with the reckless anger that Beatrice had displayed. Instead, he opted for a measured counter-strategy that would protect his garden and, in turn, send a clear message. Late one afternoon, when the pigeons had once again descended on his yard, he quietly collected some birdseed and directed the feathery intruders away from his home. But his retaliation was more targeted. He took the gathered pigeons and, with careful precision, led them toward Beatrice's prized petunia garden, a patch of land she had meticulously cultivated and boasted about at every community gathering. As the birds began to peck and disturb the delicate petals of the petunias, chaos erupted on the other side of Mapleford. Beatrice's garden, once the envy of the neighborhood, was now under siege. The air was filled with the sound of fluttering wings and the sight of petals scattering in the breeze. For Beatrice, this was a direct and personal blow, a calculated act of retribution that struck at the very core of her pride. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Some residents found the unfolding drama almost comical, a tit-for-tat exchange between two stubborn neighbors. Others, however, saw in it a deeper commentary on the escalating cycle of petty revenge that was fracturing the community. Everett, true to his nature, remained composed. He documented every incident, taking photographs of the damaged petunias and noting the exact time and conditions of each occurrence. His intent was not merely to retaliate but to build a case that would expose the destructive nature of Beatrice's vendetta. For her part, Beatrice refused to accept defeat. As her beloved garden wilted under the relentless assault of birds, she became increasingly volatile. At one point, while attempting to confront Everett in person, she tripped over a stray garden hose, sending her sprawling into her own flower beds. The sight of her drenched and disheveled form only added to the spectacle, further galvanizing public opinion against her methods. In the days that followed, both parties dug in deeper. Everett continued to safeguard his yard and sunbeam with unwavering resolve, while Beatrice's attempts to salvage her pride grew ever more desperate. The cycle of harassment and retribution had become a defining feature of the neighborhood, with each new act further eroding the sense of community that once bound Mapleford together. Throughout this period, local mediators and community leaders attempted to intervene, urging both sides to find a peaceful resolution. Yet, the wounds had grown too deep. The conflict over a single bicycle had transformed into a bitter war of pride and principle, one where every act of revenge was both a message and a challenge. By the time the tension reached its peak, Everett and Beatrice had become symbols of opposing worldviews, one representing the sanctity of personal hard work and the other embodying an unyielding sense of entitlement. And as the leaves turned gold with the arrival of autumn, it became clear to everyone in Mapleford that this feud would not be forgotten easily, for it was a battle that touched the very soul of the community. The escalating feud between Everett Langston and Beatrice Bloom eventually spilled over from private acts of retribution into a full-blown community confrontation. The small town of Mapleford, already divided by years of long-standing grievances and personal pride, found itself thrust into the spotlight as neighbors and local leaders attempted to mediate the bitter dispute. It began on a cool Saturday morning when the local community center, a modest building known for hosting town meetings, was filled to capacity. Rumors had spread that a formal assembly was being organized to address the ongoing conflict, a conflict that had now come to symbolize the broader issues of respect, responsibility, and entitlement within the town. Everett, resolute in his commitment to preserve his cherished sunbeam and the dignity of his personal achievements, attended the meeting with an air of quiet determination. Beatrice, her pride wounded yet unbowed, arrived with a storm of vitriol and demands for retribution. The meeting was a cacophony of voices, some echoing Beatrice's calls for justice for her son Roderick, others siding with Everett's plea for individual rights and personal property protection. In a moment of brave candor, Everett took the stage and began to recount his journey with Sunbeam. He spoke passionately about how he had discovered the bicycle at a flea market, the hours he spent restoring it, and the joy it brought him as a means of escape from a taxing work life. His narrative was not simply about a piece of machinery, it was a testament to perseverance, craftsmanship, and the deep personal value imbued in his labor. Beatrice, not one to be outdone, countered with her own narrative. She insisted that every child deserved an opportunity to experience the freedom and responsibility that came with owning a bicycle. To her, Roderick was a shining example of good behavior and potential, a young mind ready to embrace the world if only given the right tools. She argued that Sunbeam should be a gift to the community, a means of uplifting the next generation rather than a personal treasure to be hoarded. As the debate grew more heated, voices in the crowd rose in unison. Neighbors who had long maintained a neutral stance were now forced to take sides. Some expressed admiration for Everett's commitment to his personal legacy, while others were swayed by Beatrice's appeal to communal sharing and fairness. The moderator, a respected schoolteacher known for her calm demeanor, attempted to steer the discussion toward a compromise. However, the deep-rooted sentiments on both sides made any such compromise seem impossible. Everett, speaking with the measured authority of someone who had spent decades in service, reminded everyone that true community progress was built on the foundation of individual rights. "What I have built with my own hands," he declared, "is not merely an object to be passed around like a trinket. It is the fruit of years of dedication and hard work, and it symbolizes the freedom to pursue one's own path." His words resonated with many, eliciting nods of agreement from those who had grown weary of constant interference in their personal lives. Beatrice, her face flushed with indignation, fired back that such a stance was selfish and contrary to the spirit of neighborhood unity. "We are a community," she insisted. "No one should be allowed to hoard the means of joy when it could benefit a deserving child." Her rhetoric, while impassioned, was met with mixed reactions, a few sympathetic smiles, but many skeptical frowns. As the meeting reached its zenith, local officials intervened, urging both sides to consider mediation and reconciliation. The tension was palpable, and it was evident that the dispute over a single bicycle had become a microcosm of larger, unresolved issues within Mapleford. The community was clearly divided, with some advocating for individual freedom and others for a more collective approach to shared resources. In the end, the forum concluded without a definitive resolution, though it marked a turning point. Both Everett and Beatrice were left to reflect on the consequences of their stubbornness, and the assembled crowd departed with a lingering sense of regret at the deepening rift in their once cohesive community. The meeting was a stark reminder that the battle for respect and recognition was far from over, that the lines drawn by personal pride and communal entitlement could be as stubborn as they were divisive. As the crowd dispersed into the cool afternoon, whispers of hope mingled with the bitter taste of discord. It was clear that Mapleford would have to find a way to heal these wounds, or risk fracturing entirely under the weight of unresolved grievances. And so, with heavy hearts and determined spirits, the community set out on a slow, uncertain journey toward reconciliation. In the days following the contentious community meeting, the conflict between Everett Langston and Beatrice Bloom took one last, decisive turn. Beatrice, still reeling from the humiliation inflicted upon her and desperate to salvage her pride, unleashed a final act of retaliation. Unable to bear the shame of her ruined petunia garden, a once prized asset in her eyes. She attempted to confront Everett in a fit of anger. On a bright morning, as dew still clung to the leaves, Beatrice stormed into her own garden, intent on demanding an explanation from Everett for the series of events that had so deeply wounded her. However, in her haste and fury, she tripped over an errant garden hose and tumbled headlong into her meticulously arranged flower beds. The mishap, both comical and tragic, left her sprawled in a disarray of broken petals and damp soil. Passers-by paused, their expressions a mixture of concern and amusement, as Beatrice struggled to regain her footing. In that vulnerable moment, the consequences of her actions became painfully clear. Her reputation, already tarnished by the escalating feud, suffered an irreparable blow. Neighbors who had once silently backed her now saw her as a cautionary example of unchecked entitlement. Everett, witnessing the spectacle from a respectful distance, felt a twinge of regret. Not for his steadfast stance, but for the pain the conflict had wrought on the community. He approached quietly, offering a hand in a gesture that transcended their bitter rivalry. Though Beatrice's pride had been deeply wounded, it was clear that the cycle of retaliation had reached its inevitable conclusion. The incident quickly became the talk of Mapleford. Within hours, social media buzzed with videos and images of Beatrice's fall, and local gossip painted the scene as the final, humbling moment of a once powerful adversary. In a community meeting held shortly thereafter, several members of the Garden Club, a prestigious group that had long admired Beatrice's horticultural achievements, expressed their disappointment and called for new leadership. The fall from grace was complete, and Beatrice's influence waned dramatically. For Everett, the final act of retaliation was bittersweet. It signaled the end of a tumultuous chapter, yet it also left scars on the community that would take time to heal. He remained committed to moving forward, determined that the lessons learned from this bitter feud would lead to a more respectful and considerate Mapleford. In quiet moments, he reflected on how a cherished bicycle had become the unlikely catalyst for such profound change, and how, sometimes, even the most heated conflicts could pave the way for a new beginning. In the weeks that followed the dramatic events, Mapleford slowly began to piece itself back together. The bitter feud between Everett Langston and Beatrice Bloom had left a trail of discord in its wake, but it also sparked a vital conversation about respect, accountability, and the true meaning of community. As the final echoes of the conflict faded, neighbors came together to mend fractured relationships and restore the town's sense of unity. Everett, though still protective of his prized bicycle Sunbeam, found solace in the newfound dialogue that had emerged from the turmoil. He continued his daily rides along Mapleford's winding country roads, a quiet reminder of perseverance and personal triumph. In town meetings, residents began to voice their support for greater transparency in community affairs, advocating for policies that would prevent similar disputes in the future. The painful lessons learned from the feud prompted local officials to introduce initiatives aimed at fostering dialogue and mutual respect among neighbors. Beatrice, humbled by her public humiliation and the dissolution of her once mighty influence, retreated into quiet reflection. The loss of her standing in the Garden Club and the widespread mockery that followed her final act forced her to reconsider her approach to community engagement. Though the wounds were deep, some in Mapleford hoped that with time, she might find a path toward reconciliation and personal growth. As summer turned to autumn, a palpable change swept through the town. Neighbors who had once taken sides now began collaborating on community projects, rebuilding the local park, organizing cultural events, and even establishing a new neighborhood watch program that emphasized fairness and cooperation. The once divisive controversy over a bicycle had, inadvertently, sown the seeds of renewal and collective purpose. Everett's experience became a quiet legend in Mapleford, a testament to the power of dignity and the importance of standing up for one's rights in the face of injustice. His calm resolve in the midst of chaos served as an inspiration to many, igniting a movement for greater empathy and understanding. Public discussions, once dominated by bitter recriminations, slowly gave way to constructive dialogue about how best to preserve individual passions while nurturing a shared sense of community. In the end, the aftermath of the conflict proved to be a turning point for Mapleford. The town emerged not unscathed, but wiser and more united. The legacy of the feud, etched into the memories of every resident, became a rallying call for a future defined by cooperation rather than conflict. And as the leaves turned golden with the approach of winter, Mapleford embraced the promise of renewal, a testament to the enduring strength of community spirit.